All right, good morning and welcome. We'll be talking about chapter 7 today, which is officially titled Commerce in a Worldwide Network. But I'm also going to be focusing on these two concepts called mercantilism and colonialism. To give you a sense of where our notes are headed, this is how I've kind of set up my notes. So talking about mercantilism, I'll give different examples of mercantilism in Spanish colonies, English colonies, French colonies, and Dutch colonies. We'll talk about the 7 Years' War. And then we'll shift out more big picture, look at some of the bigger changes going on in Europe at this time, the commercial revolution and the agricultural revolution. If we're talking about time frame here, this is mostly like 1600s, bleeding over into the 1700s as well. So mercantilism, and if you look at the root word of mercantilism, you see the word mercant or merchant. Mercantilism is an idea that the government controls all trade. Or even bigger picture, mercantilism is when the government controls the entire economy. And the goal of mercantilism is not for individual businesses to make money. It's not for individual people to make a profit. Rather, the goal of mercantilism is for the state to become stronger, for the state to become more prosperous. Now, who's at the top of the state? Well, it's the king or the queen, And so mercantilism in a nutshell is the idea that the king or queen controls the economy to benefit the king or queen. So again, when we're talking about our definition of mercantilism, this is when the government controls the economy to benefit the state, or maybe to benefit the crown. And so some examples that we have of this is that they want to hoard minerals or hoard bullion. Basically, they want to get as much gold, silver, iron, etc., as possible. There was an idea at the time that, well, still true, I guess, today, there is a limited amount of gold in the world. There's a limited amount of silver in the world. And so if you can get your hand on as much gold as possible, then you're kind of controlling the profit or controlling the wealth. So hoarding minerals. They also wanted to improve transportation networks. So that's like roads, waterways, things like that. You might remember Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the finance minister under Louis XIV, did that same thing. And that was all about having increased trade. They also would promote domestic industries. Domestic means within the country. And so Jean-Baptiste Colbert encourages French businesses, French industries to have a stronger French economy. That strengthens the crown because King Louis can tax those industries, can benefit from those industries with increased trade, more money, stronger military, things like that. And then they would also raise tariffs. A tariff specifically is a tax on imports, things coming into the country. And so that would basically encourage people to buy domestic goods. Again, encouraging domestic industries. And then the last big example of mercantilism is to get colonies and to use colonies. I'm trying to phrase this. Use colonies to enrich the mother country. So the Spanish, the English, the French, the Dutch, they get colonies in the Americas and in Asia, not to benefit the Americans or the Asians, but to enrich themselves. So briefly talking about each country's colonies, and we touched on this a little bit back in chapter 3, I think. For Spain, by the 1600s, they've got this massive swath in Mexico, Central America, Latin America, and they had two main colonial governments, one in Mexico City, essentially, and then one down in Peru. It was controlled by Madrid, the capital of Spain. So Spain would appoint the governors in Mexico City and in Peru, who would then control the South American or Latin American colonies. The main purpose, the main goal, or the main industry, I guess, of Spanish colonialism was to get minerals, silver specifically. Now we talked previously about how that led to a brief golden age for Spain because it had so much, well, I guess it's actually silver age. They had this massive influx of wealth, this massive influx of silver coming into the country. So there was a brief time period when the Spanish were at the top of their game, at the top of the world. Once that silver dried up, once that silver stopped coming in, the economy crashed. But the prices were still high, and so the Spanish Golden Age or whatever was kind of short-lived because it relied on getting a lot of silver. And so the way I'm going to take these notes, and I'm actually going to redo how I do this. I'm going to basically give examples of mercantilism in each colony. So with the Spanish, one example of mercantilism in the Spanish colonies was that the goal was to acquire silver or minerals. That is a mercantilist policy because they're trying to hoard all of those minerals. Another mercantilist policy is they said all trade with the Spanish colonies must be with or must be by Spanish merchants. You can imagine who those Spanish merchants have to pay taxes to. Well, it's the king and queen. And so this is a way for the Spanish government to basically control trade with the Spanish colonies. You got to do it. Sorry, the only people to trade with the colonies are Spanish merchants. The king and queen control those taxes, so they benefit from that. Now, you might remember that the Spanish had a system called the encomienda system that was basically a forced labor system where they forced the natives to work on their land and they were essentially slaves. You hopefully remember we read some excerpts from Bartolomé de las Casas, who is a missionary priest who eventually encouraged the Spanish to reform their ways. But for now, just focusing on these examples of mercantilism in the Spanish colonies. I'm filming this on October 12th, which is Columbus Day. So let's celebrate Columbus Day by walking into someone's house and telling them we live there now. In California, we don't celebrate Columbus Day. We call it Indigenous Peoples Day. So remembering the contributions of these Native Americans that were, whose entire civilizations and cultures were destroyed because of the arrival of the Europeans, such as Columbus. Anyways, English colonialism. Originally in the 13 colonies that is now the United States, English colonialism was quite different than Spanish colonialism because the goal here was to create permanent settlements. So with the English, again, I'm going to reformat this. The goal of English colonialism was to create permanent settlements. And so they're going to have lots more agriculture, trade, industry, and not just showing up to get silver and then leave. But they did have an example of mercantilism here. And this is what was called the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts basically said any trade with the colonies must be on English ships. Basically the same thing the Spanish did. And so this was a way for the English to say, hey, if you want to trade with our colonies, it's got to be on English ships so they can get the tax money and they can control all of that revenue. And because the 13 colonies, because these English colonies also had a lot of agriculture, cotton, tobacco especially, that was intentional. The 13 colonies would produce raw materials, cotton, tobacco, etc., that would then be sold in England. And so again, this idea of hoarding minerals or hoarding just goods in general to benefit the mother country, in this case, England. The French was quite a bit different than the other ones. French colonialism, you can see, was in modern day Canada and then kind of the Midwest as well. They mostly cared just about trade. Their region of the Americas didn't have as much like valuable minerals like gold and silver. And the French didn't care about permanent settlements as much as the English did. So their region was thinly populated. You'll see only 15,000 settlers in French Canada versus 1.5 million in the English colonies. But they cared mostly about trade. In Canada and whatnot, they would trade beaver pelts and timber. And then in the Caribbean, which would be down here, it's not on this map, sorry, they would have sugar plantations, especially in Haiti, based on slavery. Whoops. So again, with the French, how is this an example of mercantilism? Well, their goal here is to extract wealth or resources from the colonies. And the examples of that is they want timber, they want beaver pelts, and they want sugar. So again, it's getting as much wealth as possible from these colonies. I should clarify, And this is all designed to enrich France. So the Spanish, they're getting as much silver to enrich Spain. The English, they're getting as much cotton and tobacco to enrich England. The French, they're getting as much natural resources and sugar to enrich the French. And then we have these other mercantilist policies that says, if you want to trade in these regions, only Spanish can do it, or only English can do it. So it's a way to control that trade to benefit the mother country back home. And then finally, Dutch colonialism. Dutch is the Netherlands. The Dutch were not in the Americas because the Americas had already been kind of split up by the Europeans. The Native Americans obviously didn't have much of a say there. The Dutch instead went to Southeast Asia. So you can see here kind of Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, that part of the world. And the Dutch did it quite differently. The Dutch voyages of exploration were not funded by the crown. You might remember that the Dutch actually had a republic called the Dutch Republic. And so at a certain point, there was no crown, there was no king. Instead, Dutch colonialism was funded by what were called joint stock companies, basically private businesses. The Dutch East India Company was the main joint stock company, and you as a private citizen could invest in the Dutch East India Company. You could put your money into the company. When they made profits, which they made immense profits through spice trade especially, you would profit from that. The Dutch basically had no power in the Americas. I mean, they briefly held New York, but it's called New Amsterdam at the time, but that didn't last very long. And so the Dutch are interesting because they, so they have the Dutch East India Company, which is a joint stock company that was not funded by the crown. They make huge profits with the spice trade, especially in Southeast Asia. And so I would argue that this is probably not an example of mercantilism because of a couple of reasons. First, it's not controlled by the government, it's controlled by merchants. And it's not enriching the government, it's enriching merchants, it's enriching private people. So it's not an example of mercantilism because it's controlled by merchants and it enriched merchants rather than the king and queen, which remember, there wasn't one in the Dutch Republic. Okay, so we have these different examples of mercantilist policies in the colonies. Again, generally speaking, we have them trying to get as much wealth as possible, resources as possible. And then we have these policies where they're saying you can only trade with our colonies if you are from our country, a way to control tax revenue, basically. Some other details from the age of exploration, just a review of what we talked about back in chapter 3. You hopefully might remember this concept called the triangular trade. There was trade from Europe to Africa to the Americas and then back. And you might remember that every single direction of trade is benefiting Europe. And so what's going from Africa to the Americas? Well, it's slaves, enslaved Africans. That doesn't benefit the Africans, that doesn't benefit the Americans, it benefits Europe. Because what do those slaves do? They produce raw goods, sugar, tobacco, cotton, that is then brought to Europe. So Europe benefits from slave labor because they're producing goods for cheap. Europe benefits from these natural resources that they're getting. And then Europe takes these natural resources, turns them into manufactured goods, like textiles, rum, or other goods, and sells those or trades those things to Africa for those enslaved Africans. So again, this triangular trade shows us kind of the movement of people and goods and natural resources. But again, only Europe is benefiting from this triangular trade. And the middle passage is another term associated with the age of exploration that describes the passage from Africa to the Americas for these enslaved Africans. You can see the living conditions were incredibly crowded, unsanitary, inhumane. They would be stuffed in basically like cattle, as if they were livestock. And that's actually what they would be listed as. If you were to look on the ship's manifest, the list of what a ship had, they wouldn't be listed as humans or passengers, they'd be listed next to the livestock. And so that was how they were treated by the Europeans. Now, not surprisingly, because you have so many European countries in the Americas, this also led to war between these European countries in the Americas. This is called both the 7 Years' War and also called the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War in Europe was a conflict over who has the most power in Europe. And it was essentially Prussia and England against Austria, France, and Russia. But really, I like to think of the 7 Years' War as kind of another chapter in the continuing conflict between England and France. They're going to become kind of some of the main rivals in Europe during the 1700s and 1800s. A bunch of other countries join in. You'll see Prussia joins up with England, Austria and Russia join up with France. So there's a war in Europe called the 7 Years' War. And it's basically over who's going to have the most power, who's going to be the main authority in Europe. This war bleeds over into the New World as well, so it causes conflict in the Americas as well. This is called the French and Indian War, and it's a competition over who controls the Ohio Valley. The French claimed that they had it. The British, led by George Washington, tried to take it or claimed that they owned it as well. And so there's a conflict over who owns that land. By the time the 7 Years' War or the Treaty of Paris, by the time the 7 Years' War or French and Indian War is over, the effects are interesting because in Europe, nothing changes. In Europe, they go back to the same old balance of power that there had always been. In Europe, there's really no winner or loser. They go back to the status quo, back to normal. In America, though, it was a devastating loss for France. France lost the French and Indian War to the British, and they were basically forced to give up all of their colonies, both in the Americas and also in India or Southeast Asia. So, again, when we talk about the Treaty of Paris, in Europe, nothing changes. But in the Americas, France gives up basically all of their colonies. This is important because England is now able to be basically number one in the Americas. They are the authority in the Americas. And so you can see here the French. Well, where are the French? They've got Haiti up until 1802 or so when the Haitians will rebel and win their independence. And so the British, they used to just have the 13 colonies, but now they get this massive tract of land here and here. The Spanish are still here, although we will see the British slowly chipping away at Spanish power. So again, the English, by the Treaty of Paris, are basically the authority in the Americas, or at least in North America. All right, shifting gears for our last two slides to kind of some bigger picture changes that we see. This whole presentation has been about increased trade. It's about increased trade between Europe and the Americas. But remember, this trade is controlled by Europeans to benefit only the Europeans. And so this is something that's called, this is called the Commercial Revolution, which is basically a period of increased trade, increased businesses during this time period. And so I'll just say during, I don't know, 1500s to 1700s. It's kind of a big time frame. And much of this is due to colonialism and mercantilism. Remember, colonialism is all of these colonies and all of the resources and trade that they're doing. But then mercantilism also means building roads, encouraging French businesses to grow. And so all of this leads to increased trade, increased profits. So we're getting the natural resources and the exports from colonialism. And so what we're seeing is what we'll see here is we'll see inflation, increased prices, but we'll also see increased prosperity, increased wealth, increased profits or wealth, but again, mostly just for the wealthy. If you remember a couple of chapters ago, we talked about how the peasants, they're not benefiting from this mostly, although we'll see some minor effects for them in a second. So again, the commercial revolution leads to a lot of increased trade, a lot of increased wealth for merchants in Europe. Alongside the commercial revolution, there's also an agricultural revolution that does affect your more average peasant or your more average European. And that was mostly because of the enclosure movement that we talked about a couple of chapters ago, where you take a bunch of small farms and you enclose them together into one big farm. Now, that one big farm would typically be owned by a large landowner. And so private farmers, small peasants, they're going to lose their land, which sucks. And because you have these much bigger farms that are all owned and managed and operated by one person, it's way more efficient. So farm production actually triples with actually using fewer workers. And so we have better diets, longer lifespans, because there's more food. Now, again, in terms of who this benefits, who this harms, it mostly benefits the wealthy, because the peasants, they lose their land and they lose kind of their independence, and they oftentimes have to move to the city to find work, basically. Chapter 9 also talks about two other kind of economic or commercial changes, one of which is the cottage industry or proto-industrialization. We'll get to the Industrial Revolution in January in chapter 13 or 14, I can't remember. Eventually there will be the Industrial Revolution, massive factories, the assembly line, machines and new inventions. The cottage industry or proto-industrialization is just kind of an early stepping stone towards that. Rather than farmers making their stuff at home and then selling their stuff in their village, they have a system where workers in their farms, in their villages, would make stuff, chairs, rugs, clothing, whatever. They would then sell those goods to merchants. Those merchants would go to the city and then sell those goods in the city. And so this is starting to lead to increased trade. It's starting to lead to this system where the people in rural areas make stuff to give to the people in the urban areas to buy. And so again, big picture, what we're seeing here is we're seeing the emergence of national trade, not just regional trade. You're not just trading within your region, within your farm or village, but you're trading within the entire nation. And that's because of the roads and waterways that increase trade. That's because domestic industries are doing much better. That's because they're getting all of these minerals or raw materials, cotton, tobacco, so they have all of the stuff that they need to trade much more. So I don't know what I meant when I said effects here, but I'll just talk about kind of who benefits and who is harmed here. This certainly benefits the crown because, again, remember the goal of mercantilism is to enrich the state. It certainly benefits merchants because we see increased trade, we see inflation, we see huge profits. And then for peasants, I'm just going to kind of put a question mark by here because we're kind of seeing both with peasants. We're seeing them being a little screwed over with the enclosure movement. And because of the cottage system, they do have some new opportunities. Because of the enclosure movement, they do have access to more foods. So it's kind of both. So they have some new work plus better diets, but you also see increased poverty as they're kicked off of their land. And again, that's a trend that we'll see throughout this course of who benefits and who doesn't. Who benefits from colonialism, who benefits from mercantilism, who benefits from this economic boom? It's not really the peasants, it's mostly the wealthy. So if you need to pause here to get these notes, again, we've got mercantilism, the big examples, the big definitions plus examples for each. And then we've got the bigger changes going on, increased commerce and increased agricultural production.